The courtroom held its breath when she walked in. A 15-year-old girl, small in her frame, steady in her steps, moving as if the room belonged to her. No fear on her face. No sign of the kind of panic you'd expect from someone accused of something unthinkable. She glanced around with a quiet curiosity, while on the opposite bench, a mother pressed a photo of her 9-year-old daughter against her heart, holding it the way people hold on to hope they know is already gone. To understand how these two lives collided, we have to return to a neighborhood where life felt simple, ranch-style homes, porch lights glowing at dusk, kids running between yards without a second thought. In that world, Elizabeth Olten finished her homework, zipped up her pink jacket, and told her mom she'd be home soon. It was an ordinary promise from a child who still slept with the hallway light on. But just a few houses away, another teenager was wrestling with thoughts she kept hidden behind quiet smiles and dark jokes. And on this night, those thoughts were about to cross paths with a child who never saw danger coming. It started with a mother stepping out onto her porch and calling her daughter's name into the cold October air. The steam from the kitchen still drifted through the open door behind her, carrying the smell of dinner that had been waiting longer than it should have. Elizabeth had said she would be home before dark, and she always kept that kind of promise, the kind built into the routine of childhood. Her mother called again, this time louder, and the quiet in the yard felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. She checked the clock, checked the backyard, checked the small stretch of woods behind their house, hoping to see her little girl in that pink jacket. But instead, there was only the sound of leaves moving gently across the grass and the unsettling thought that something about this night wasn't following the rules of their normal life. Within minutes, the small neighborhood began shifting from calm to alert as mothers stepped onto porches, fathers grabbed jackets, and someone called out, "Has anyone seen Elizabeth?" A friend of the family remembers saying, "She doesn't wander. She's not that kind of kid," and those words traveled fast because everyone knew they were true. Neighbors picked up flashlights and began walking the narrow paths that led into the woods, shining beams across fallen branches and the familiar trails their children used every day. Elizabeth's mother reported her missing at 6:50 p.m., and officers from Cole County responded quickly, knowing darkness would soon take away their advantage. The search grew larger as the temperature dropped, and the sound of dogs barking carried through the trees like an alarm stretching from one yard to the next. Radios crackled with updates, each one sounding more urgent than the last, and every adult felt it deep in their chest. This wasn't just a late child, something was wrong. Deputies moved through the woods in long, careful lines, their boots pressing into soft earth while handlers guided search dogs that pulled hard on their leads. One officer later told reporters, "When you're looking for a child, every second feels loud," and that was exactly how the night unfolded. Every rustle, every shift in the wind, every snap in the leaves felt like it carried weight. As search teams swept the area, one set of eyes in the crowd stood out briefly, though no one understood the meaning at the time. 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante stood among the volunteers, hair falling over part of her face, flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. A neighbor remembers her asking quietly, "Do you think they'll find her soon?" before stepping back into the shadows and leaving with a haste that didn't match the concern she voiced. Those who noticed the moment chalked it up to nerves, unaware her heart was racing for reasons she didn't dare let anyone see. By late evening, the woods echoed with the distant calls of searchers who refused to stop despite the cold cutting deeper into the night. An officer described hearing the soft crunch of leaves under 100 footsteps, a sound that built into a steady rhythm as more people arrived to help. Flashlights swept over ditches, creek beds, and the edges of the walking trail, while investigators asked neighbors for timelines and descriptions. Elizabeth's mother gave officers the last words her daughter said before she left her friend's home, "I'll be home soon." That sentence hung heavily in the air as search teams worked, because parents recognized the innocence inside those words, the trust children place in the world around them. Hours passed, and though hope remained, fear had begun pressing in from the edges, making every silence feel heavier than the last. Around midnight, a deputy noticed an area of disturbed soil near a cluster of trees, the kind of ground that catches the eye because it doesn't match the rest of its surroundings. The officer radioed the discovery, and within moments, investigators gathered around the spot, kneeling down and brushing away leaves with careful hands. The dirt had been turned recently, too recently to ignore, and the shape beneath suggested someone had dug there with purpose, not chance. A supervisor leaned in, lifted more soil, and said quietly, "We need lights over here now," and the urgency in his voice shot through the team like a warning. It was the first concrete sign they had seen all night, a sign no one wanted to find but knew they couldn't walk away from. As officers worked, they uncovered what appeared to be a shallow grave, but when they reached the bottom, it was empty. The silence around that small patch of earth felt heavier than the hours that came before, and the investigators exchanged glances that needed no explanation. Something had been here. Something had been moved. And as one officer stepped back and whispered, "This wasn't an animal. Someone did this," the entire direction of the search shifted. The realization that they were no longer just looking for a missing child, but for answers hidden in the dark, cut through every person on the scene. And while the woods stood still in the cold night air, the officers understood that the most unsettling part of this discovery wasn't the empty ground, it was the question of who had put something there in the first place, and where it had been taken next. Cliffhanger, and as the team stood over that disturbed soil, unaware of the truth sitting just a few yards away, one of the officers said the words that would echo through the next days of the investigation. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, and they're close. Detectives began their work before sunrise on October 22, 2009, moving through the neighborhood with a quiet focus that set a different tone from the frantic search hours earlier. They retraced Elizabeth's last known steps, walking the narrow path from her friend's home toward the woods, noting how short the distance actually was and how quickly a child could vanish in that stretch of trees. Officers knocked on doors again, this time asking more pointed questions: what time adults saw Elizabeth, who was outside, which kids were near the woods, and whether anyone noticed something that didn't fit into the normal routine of a Wednesday evening. When they reached the Bustamante home, Alyssa answered with a flat tone, telling officers she hadn't seen Elizabeth and offering a timeline that shifted slightly each time she repeated it. One detective later said, her behavior didn't match the moment, explaining that while other teenagers were scared and emotional, Alyssa seemed distracted and disconnected, like she was trying to remember the story she already created. And as she walked away, an officer noticed fresh scratches across her arms, scratches she explained by saying she'd fallen in the woods earlier that day. Officers documented the marks and continued their canvass, but Alyssa stayed firmly on their radar because her account raised red flags that had nothing to do with teenage awkwardness. As investigators pulled school records and interviewed classmates, they learned that Alyssa had a history of writing and speaking about self-harm, sharing posts online that made some students uncomfortable long before Elizabeth went missing. One classmate recalled, "She liked talking about dark stuff, but you never think it's real," a statement officers wrote down because it matched other comments they heard around school that day. Detectives also discovered Alyssa kept a YouTube channel under a different name where she uploaded videos with references to cutting and emotional numbness, though at the time, many dismissed it as the dramatic expression of a struggling teen. But what truly caught investigators' attention came from her personal journal, where entries dated days before Elizabeth disappeared mentioned a "perfect idea," a phrase prosecutors later highlighted because of how cold and deliberate it sounded on paper. The discovery pushed Alyssa from a concerned neighbor to someone investigators needed to question with far more seriousness. Detectives requested access to Alyssa's social media pages, and what they found confirmed their growing concern that this case was no longer just a missing child investigation. Her online posts showed months of emotional struggle, including messages like, "I'm dead inside," and "I cut because it helps," entries that lined up with the scars she carried on her arms. Investigators noted a drawing in her notebook that depicted a grave with a stick figure beside it, a detail that felt harder to ignore now that a disturbed patch of soil had been found near the search area. Officers also learned that Alyssa had been released from a psychiatric facility just a year earlier after attempting to harm herself, information that her family had tried their best to manage privately. What troubled detectives most was how calmly Alyssa answered questions compared to the emotional state of everyone else in the neighborhood. One officer remarked, "It was like she was watching the investigation instead of being part of it," and that observation became one more piece of a puzzle that now pointed in a direction no one wanted to accept. As they cross-referenced statements, detectives discovered a detail that shifted the entire tone of the investigation. Two separate kids reported seeing Alyssa in the woods days before Elizabeth went missing, carrying a small shovel. One neighbor confirmed this, telling investigators, "I thought she was digging for something, maybe planting something. I didn't think twice." That comment led officers back to the area where the empty grave had been found hours earlier, prompting them to widen the search perimeter and test soil samples in nearby patches. When investigators brought in a forensic anthropologist to evaluate the disturbed ground, he confirmed that the soil had been moved at least twice, meaning someone dug there before the night Elizabeth disappeared. Detectives returned to speak with Alyssa again, this time noting the tension in her hands, how she fidgeted, how she avoided looking at the wooded area behind her house when officers asked about her week. The more they pressed, the more cracks began to show in the version of events she kept trying to repeat. Late that afternoon, detectives compared all timelines once more, marking each discrepancy in bright red ink, realizing Alyssa's story no longer held together even loosely. Officers interviewed her siblings, who confirmed that Alyssa often walked into the woods alone and seemed preoccupied with the area where the soil had been disturbed. One sibling recalled a moment days earlier when Alyssa came inside with dirt on her shoes and mud on her jeans, saying, "She was out there forever." With this information, investigators returned to the Bustamante home with a more direct line of questioning, hoping to understand what exactly Alyssa had been doing in the woods. When confronted with the fact that the disturbed patch of dirt had been tested and shown signs of being dug before the search began, Alyssa's expressions shifted rapidly. First confusion, then frustration, and finally something closer to resignation. Detectives noted she was shaking slightly as she tried to maintain her earlier explanations, but the stories no longer made sense even to her. The room went quiet as one detective finally asked the question they had been building toward, "Alyssa, what did you do out there?" She looked down at her hands, pressing her fingers together so tightly her knuckles turned white, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. Another officer leaned in and said gently, "If there's something you haven't told us, now is the time." Her breathing grew uneven, and her face flushed, a stark contrast to the calm she carried when the search first began. She whispered something too soft to hear, so the detective asked her to repeat it, and this time, tears formed in her eyes as she said, "You'll find her if you go back." Her voice cracked, and when asked where exactly, she finally whispered the location, naming a spot deeper in the woods that hadn't been searched yet. And in that moment, quiet, strained, and trembling, the investigation took its turn, leaving officers staring at each other with the realization that the truth they feared was no longer hidden. Cliffhanger, and as detectives stepped out of that room to organize a new search team, one officer said under his breath, "Whatever we find next." Everything changes. Detectives gathered in a small interview room just after Alyssa whispered the location, and the tension in that space grew heavier as they waited for confirmation from the search team in the woods. When the radio finally buzzed with the words, "We found something," the lead detective returned to Alyssa, sitting across from her while she kept her hands folded in her lap as if she were waiting for a routine appointment. Her face remained steady, but her breathing told a different story, and when he said, "Alyssa, they're at the spot you mentioned," she blinked slowly, almost as if she already knew what came next. The detective leaned forward and said, "We need you to tell us what happened out there," and for a moment, she stared at the table with a blank expression that unsettled everyone standing behind the glass. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I killed her," and the room shifted into a silence that felt impossible to describe. One detective would later say, "It wasn't the words that shook me. It was how she said them, like she was talking about something that wasn't real." When detectives asked her to explain, Alyssa described the act with a calmness that left officers questioning if she fully understood the gravity of what she had done. She admitted she strangled Elizabeth first, saying, "She was fighting. I didn't think it would be that hard," before explaining how she used a knife to stab her. A detective who testified later recalled asking her why she did it, and Alyssa responded with the line that spread across the country, "I wanted to know what it felt like." The officers in that room didn't speak for several seconds because the answer didn't come with tears or rage or confusion. It came with a flat, matter-of-fact tone that investigators said felt like hearing a rehearsed confession from someone older, not a teenager. One detective wrote in his report, "She showed no panic, no remorse, only a strange curiosity, like she was explaining a science experiment." And even in that moment, while Elizabeth's body was being recovered from a shallow grave, Alyssa's expression barely changed. After the confession, investigators began piecing together the years that led to this night, uncovering details of a childhood marked by emotional instability, abandonment, and a long struggle with mental illness. Court records showed Alyssa had attempted suicide at least twice before the age of 15, once by overdosing and once by cutting so deeply she required hospitalization. She had been placed in a psychiatric facility in 2007, and doctors diagnosed her with major depression, recommending ongoing treatment, which her family tried to maintain despite the challenges of raising multiple children with limited resources. Her mother had a history of substance abuse, and her father was incarcerated, leaving her grandmother with most of the responsibility for raising her. Records show she had been prescribed antidepressants and mood-stabilizing medication, though she often failed to take them consistently. Prosecutors later emphasized that while her mental health struggles were real, they did not explain the level of planning that went into what happened to Elizabeth. As the truth spread through the community, Elizabeth's parents collapsed under a weight no family should ever face. A neighbor recalled seeing Elizabeth's mother fall to her knees in the yard, crying out, "My baby. Please, God, no," as officers tried to surround the family with support. People who lived on that small street remembered the quiet that settled over the neighborhood, the kind of silence that changes a place forever. Elizabeth's father asked investigators through tears, "Why would she do this? She's just a kid," a question detectives admitted they couldn't answer even after the confession. The entire area of St. Martin's, Missouri, fell into a state of grief, struggling with the reality that a teen they knew, a girl who lived only a few houses away, had taken the life of a child everyone loved. The divide between those two homes, once walked freely by neighbors and children, became a line no one could cross without feeling the weight of loss. Inside the interview room, detectives pressed gently for more detail, trying to understand how long Alyssa had been planning this. She admitted she dug the graves days before the murder because she wanted to be ready, and officers noted how she said the words without emotion, as though she were describing a chore. One detective asked, "Did you think about her family?" and Alyssa shrugged slightly before answering, "I wasn't thinking about them." Another investigator, who would later testify in court, said, "It was the most unsettling interview of my career. She was calm the entire time." Officers collected her diary, which contained entries that would later become key evidence in court, including one written the night of the murder that read, "I just killed someone. I strangled them and stabbed them. It was amazing." The last word stunned prosecutors because of how casually she wrote it, followed by, "I don't know how to feel now." The diary revealed another line prosecutors said made them lose their breath. One written in hurried handwriting, almost like she wanted to document the adrenaline before it faded. The line said, "I feel better now," a sentence that reporters later described as chilling because of how detached it sounded from the gravity of the moment. Detectives showed the diary to mental health experts, who said the phrasing reflected deep emotional numbness, but none could justify the calculated steps she took before and after the killing. Officers took the diary as evidence, sealing it while prosecutors prepared to present a case that now carried details no one in the community would ever forget. As they walked out of the interview room, one detective said, "I've never seen a mask drop like that in my life," referring to how quickly Alyssa shifted from calm resistance to a confession that changed everything. And with the diary entry in their hands, investigators knew the next steps would no longer be about searching for Elizabeth, they would now be about seeking answers in a courtroom where a whole town waited to hear what would come next.